Good morning, everyone. Here we are, or good afternoon or good evening, depending what time you're watching this. This is once again a review of Module 8. This one's a little bit shorter this week because we had the test as well. So if you have not had a chance to write the test, please contact me immediately and let me know so I can reopen it. But this week will be just Module 8, and then we're going to carry on the following week with 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and so on. Okay, so this week we're going to look at democracy and social contract theory, or theories in this case, because we have a couple of them to look at. The ideas presented by Locke and Rousseau are very similar, and they, of course, segue rather nicely with the ideas presented by John Stuart Mill. So let's break down each one. The first one is John Locke, his two treatises of government that were written in 1690. And his idea is, unlike Hobbes, who, if you remember a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about the monarchy and absolutism and kingdoms and kings and so on, he was an absolutist, which meant that it was absolute power that was given to the monarchy. John Locke, by the sort of coming from a different perspective, also English, thought rather differently about the absolute power of anything. That was inherently bad. So what he wants to do is to create a more civilized society based on natural rights that we have in the state of nature, and combine those with a contract theory where individuals come together willingly to form a state. So it is, in a sense, a way to protect what is good in the state of nature, which is freedom and liberty, and bring that and not only confirm it, but also protect it by law through contract theory. And that's really what it is. And Locke thought that because individuals in a state of nature had reason, this step from a state of nature to a social contract was an evolutionary step. It was a natural step. No one was forced into it. No one rejected it or thought this was a bad idea. It was simply an evolution in our history of consciousness. So if that's the case, then we want to at least establish what this contract is going to consist of. And again, fairly straightforward. Political power is a right of making laws with penalties of death. So we are giving the state the right to put us to death, to use lethal force against us if we don't obey. Now, that in itself, if you are someone who is a lover of law and order, that can be a fine thing, but it's not a two-way street. We do not reserve the right to put to death politicians or kings that we don't like. It's a one-way street, and so because of that, that political power needs to be constructed in such a way that it still benefits us. So political power is a right to make laws which include penalties that can put us to death. Now, this doesn't mean that it's a death penalty for jaywalking or spitting on the sidewalk. No, it is for the crimes that are committed against the state in terms of treason, sedition, murder, serious crimes. So if that's the case, then that political power not only protects us from criminals, allegedly, but it also regulates and preserves property and the common good. So we have laws that are constructed that protect us as persons and protect us as owners of property. So this is really Locke's main theme. So we need to consider the state in which all individuals are naturally free, which is the state of nature, and the state of perfect freedom, and in a sense really absolute freedom as well, and then turn it around and say, now we need to be able to protect those individuals, bring in what is good about the state of nature, freedom and liberty, but also do it in such a way that people are also equal, because this was something that was not possible in a state of nature. The state of equality, although not a fiction, but a legal structure, because everyone is equal before the law, unless you get a good lawyer. The notion of equality now is entrenched into laws. Everyone is equal before the law. In a state of nature, where there was no legal system, people were unequal. The stronger always survived. And the more powerful, whether it's in terms of strength, was also typically the winner in a state of nature. So we need to make sure that no matter what, right, that political power party, that civil government, is the remedy for the kinds of inconveniences, which is again a rather soft word that Locke uses, the inconveniences of the state of nature. If a member of your family is killed, if they are murdered in a raid, for example, or someone steals all your stuff, that's at the very least an inconvenience. But the whole idea with Locke's contract is that these so-called inconveniences of the state of nature are remedied and dealt with legally with enforcement of the law by the political power that is there in place at that particular time. Now, Locke also reserves the right to not overthrow a government through revolution, but overthrow it by voting it out. And let's remember, just the idea of voting, the idea of individuals having a say in how the state is run and who will represent them, that in itself is revolutionary. Because at the time that Locke is writing in 1690, these kinds of political entities don't even exist yet. So at the time he's writing, these are just ideas. Powerful ideas, absolutely, but still only ideas. And this is how Jean-Jacques Rousseau received some of these ideas from John Locke, and he developed it from a French perspective. So Rousseau, although he was Swiss, he spent a lot of time in France, a lot of time in Paris in particular, very much influenced by Locke's two treatises of government, and he wrote his own social contract, which was based very much on Locke's treatises of government. And Rousseau, that is, his claim to fame is really kind of setting the theoretical foundation for the French Revolution. And not only that, but the idea of modern political thought and educational thought and how important education was in creating a good citizen. This is what Rousseau wanted to do with Locke's work, was to harness it to the particularities of French life. A lack of education, a lack of choice, a lack of abilities to decide. The French church, the Catholic Church, was very powerful at the time Rousseau was writing. And so again, Rousseau was writing at a time when these institutions have not yet come into being, but his ideas were deeply influential to the French people. And those ideas led, some believe, amongst other writers too, but Rousseau's ideas really set the foundation for the French Revolution and eventually the complete restructuring of French society along legal and political lines. And what happened was, in the social contract that Rousseau presents, he creates what's called a body politic, right? And the body politic is the collection of all of the citizens of that community. So you can be a French citizen of France, you could be a Parisian, you can be living in a particular county somewhere that has a representative. But Rousseau even didn't want to go that far. He wanted direct democracy. He wanted people to be able to speak directly to each other to decide what rules were going to be the best. So there was at least a little bit of tinkering with Rousseau's original ideas. The idea, of course, being that direct democracy was not possible in a city of almost, at that time, probably close to 500,000 people. This is an idea that Rousseau took from the Greeks, this idea of direct democracy, individuals sitting in the agora and discussing matters, right, sitting in the marketplace and discussing and persuading each other that one law or one rule is better than another. This is what Rousseau wanted, because the people up to this point had no voice. So there was some compromise, and one of them was to create everyone as one, right, the body politic. And the body politic is basically the citizens of that state. So under state laws, we are both subjects because we're subject to laws and restrictions, but we're also citizens because we can vote. So the sovereign, which is the ruling government of the day, it too may use force to ensure that individuals follow the general will. Now, what is the general will? Briefly, it's this idea that Rousseau presents that the will of the people should be followed, should be not only mandated, but followed. But what if the general will is, well, let's kick out all the immigrants. Let's kick all the brown people out. What do? Well, Rousseau says, well, it's a free country, and because of the general will, if that's what people want, you'll be forced to be free. You'll be forced to follow through. So this is an idea that, for me, it troubles me greatly, this idea of a general will, because it can be very dangerous. A general will in a far right-wing country, a fascistic country like Germany in the 1930s and 40s, that was extremely dangerous. So I don't think Rousseau had that idea in mind. What he wanted was, again, the will of the people to be heard. That's what he wanted us to think of. So because of that, the people were allowed to talk, and the sovereign, or the body politic, also knew that the sovereign could use force, but there was a clear limit as to how much force it could use. So why is that important? Because force doesn't create right. Just because I'm more powerful than you doesn't make me right. So the strongest is never strong enough and will always be the master unless that strength is transformed into a right and that obedience into a duty. So if we're going to follow the general will, it's because we want to, not because we're forced to. And Rousseau says anyone who's forced to do anything else, which again kind of contradicts what I've just described as the general will, he thinks that if you are forced to do something other than what you wish, that is not right. That's immoral and unethical. To yield to force is an act of necessity or prudence, not a free will. So if citizens have to obey by force, then they have no need to obey by duty. They simply are trying to protect themselves. It's more self-preservation than it is with, following through on some kind of moral or ethical mandate. So we need to remember that if we're forced to obey, we're under no obligation to do so. So that is essentially Rousseau. And the last individual I want to look at, I want to keep this brief, is John Stuart Mill, writing in roughly the 1860s. He was a utilitarian, and his notion of morality and ethics fell under this rubric of utility. And what is utility? It is the idea of the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Now, whether that's a general will, that's debatable. But what Mill is arguing is that morality requires us to promote utility, which is the desire to do what is most useful to the well-being of the greatest number of people. Now, notice I don't say all of the people, because utility will often leave people out, and this is one of its weaknesses, not one of its strengths. But Mill thought that if we can apply the same principles of utility to human liberty and freedom, we will, for the most part, create a freer and freer society. Now, what does that look like? For Mill, he said that, look, the extent to which any form of government with coercive powers tries to limit the freedom of individuals, we will say no when we believe that there's been government overreach. Now, these ideas should sound pretty familiar because we've heard this kind of terminology, this kind of language being discussed in terms of the pandemic, the government response to the pandemic. Some individuals completely lost sight of the fact that the pandemic response by the government was a public health crisis, not some kind of permanent government overreach. So I'd be curious to know how Mill would have looked at that. I hope he would have sided with those who remind everyone else it's a public health crisis. If doing something is for the greater good, then wearing a mask, getting vaccinated, socially distancing, that's a utilitarian approach to deal with a sickness, right? With a disease, with a pandemic. So if that's the case, we still need to keep in mind the fact that government should only be restricting our liberty to a certain degree. If we are actively harming others, then absolutely the government can step in. But if we're doing something that doesn't harm anyone else, according to Mill, we should be allowed to do it. In fact, in his book on liberty, Mill specifies 3 appropriate regions of human liberty. And these, again, are absolutely relevant and crucial to anyone living in 2023, especially living through and past the pandemic. The first one is consciousness itself. Liberty of consciousness in the most complete sense, along with liberty of thought and feeling. So 1, consciousness itself. 2, personal taste and pursuits. In other words, our subjectivity, our individuality. We should be able to live our lives according to how we see fit, what we think is important. And 3 is freedom of assembly. And again, it's specified freedom of assembly for any purpose other than harming or involving harm to others. In other words, we can assemble to protest, to demonstrate, to to express our general will, maybe, if you want to be Rousseauian about it, but freedom of assembly for any purpose not involving harm to others. So we should be able to express ourselves through demonstrations and open debates, as long as we're not coercing or deceiving others. So Mill's ideas from 1860 are remarkably relevant in this day and age. So those three regions of human liberty: consciousness, personal taste and freedom of assembly. So that's essentially it. Those are the highlights of this particular module. So I'll be back again next week with modules 9 and 10. And we're just going to carry on. We're at the halfway point. Again, like I mentioned, if you've not handed in your essay or completed the test, the midterm, please contact me immediately so I can help you to get this completed, because it is a compressed course and we have very little time left. We're literally halfway through the course at this point. So take care, and we'll see each other next week. Bye-bye.